Hello everyone, I'm Joshua Berger. I'm the head of the Biodiversity Footprint Department at CDC Biodiversité. Welcome to this short presentation of the GBS. To start with some context on global biodiversity loss, if we go on the next slide, so on this slide you can see the remaining biodiversity at the global level on the vertical axis. So in 2010 we were having only 68% biodiversity remaining, and we were losing about 0.27% per year, which would lead us in 2050 at 58.5% remaining biodiversity. And that's biodiversity defined as ecosystem health, so the integrity of ecosystems. On this chart, you can also see the limit, the planetary boundary for biodiversity, which has been defined as 72% remaining mean species abundance, a metric I'm going to detail later. And you can see that the boundary has been crossed. So we are losing biodiversity at an alarming rate, and we are out of the safe operating space. And the third information you can see on this chart is the blue line. So the blue trajectory. So that's the trajectory of COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this COP15 in Montreal should have this trajectory for ecosystem integrity, having no net loss of biodiversity by 2030, so stopping the erosion of biodiversity, and then gaining about 15 to 20% of biodiversity by 2050. So we have this trajectory, and on the next slide, we can see that the tools that allow to assess the contribution of businesses and financial institutions to this trajectory. So that's the trajectory I showed was the global trajectory. And then how do business and financial institutions contribute to achieving this trajectory? So on this mapping, you can see a number of tools. You might be concerned there are too many, but actually the tools that exist meet different needs. That's what we can see here, because the mapping show in columns the focus areas that the tool address, so public policy, corporate and portfolio, so comparing supply options, product and services, and project or site level. And also in lines, you can see the business applications supported. And here we distinguished three business applications. So the first one is, if we go back to the PowerPoint and not the Menti, the assessment and rating by and for third parties with external data. So that's a very specific business application. That's, for instance, having companies being assessed by rating agencies, ESG rating agencies. So only a limited number of tools allow that. Then the second business application on the chart is biodiversity accounting for external audited disclosure. So for instance, that's the reporting for the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive of the EU or TNFD, and which can be audited by third parties, which require specific data collection, etc. And then all the other business applications are grouped here in biodiversity management and performance. The GBS, the tool we are going to talk about today, is in the top left. And so that's corporate and financial asset assessments in terms of focus area. And that's that can be used for assessment by third parties or for third parties. And it also can be audited. The second information interesting on this chart is that there are two main types of metrics being used by corporates and financial institutions. Metrics on ecosystems, so that's the two in green, and then metrics on species and the risk of extinction of species, and that's the metric in blue. On the chart, you also have three other types of metrics, but I won't detail them, and they are not the ones which are the most used by businesses and which are the most related to the trajectory I just showed on the previous slide, which is focused on ecosystems. So then the MSA, the mean species abundance, I'm going to detail it a bit later, but the interesting thing here on this mapping is you've got all the tools in dark green, which use the MSA metric. And you see that's the most tools use that, and that it covers all the different business applications and focus areas. Then on the next slide, the mean species abundance. So what is it? That's a metric so as I said, covering ecosystem integrity, the health of ecosystems, and it's between 0 and 100%. So 100% MSA is a healthy ecosystem, undisturbed. For instance, a pristine forest, an undisturbed pasture, that can work for any ecosystem. So that can also be a wetland or other types of aquatic ecosystems. And 0%, that's for instance, a lifeless parking lot. And all in between, you have all different types of ecosystems, more or less degraded. So for instance, a plantation is about 30% MSA. So the MSA is the metric of the health of ecosystems. You can understand it as a health bar, for instance, for ecosystems, as in video games, for instance, or the integrity of the ecosystem. On the next slide, so you've got the MSA in percent, and then you have a surface over which it applies. And so we conduct a spatial integration, and we end up with MSA square kilometers or MSA hectares, etc. And so a loss of 1 square kilometer MSA, an impact of 1 square kilometer MSA in the gray box, is equivalent to the artificialization of 1 square kilometers of undisturbed natural habitat into, for instance, a lifeless parking lot with 0% MSA. So, for instance, on the right, you have an example. If we convert a pristine forest into a plantation over an area of 100 square kilometers, the pressure impact relationships that we use tell us that the pristine forest is at 100% MSA, and the plantation is at 30% MSA. So that's the remaining biodiversity here. And so that means, for instance, 70% loss for the plantation. So moving from 100% to 30% over an area of 100 square kilometers, that's an impact of 70 square kilometers MSA of biodiversity loss. Obviously, we can also measure gains, and we can measure the remaining biodiversity, not just the impacts. On the next slide, so those two slides were about the metric, the MSA. Now about the tool, so the Global Biodiversity Score tool, the GBS. On this chart, you see at the top the methodological framework, and at the bottom examples of data that we can use. So if we start on the top right, that's what we want to assess, the impacts on biodiversity and the biodiversity state. And so at the bottom right, you see that we could use exhaustive ecological surveys to measure that, but that's usually very costly and technically difficult. So that's more accurate, but that's less feasible. So usually we use proxies, and the more we go on the left of the chart, the easier it is, the more feasible it is, but the less accurate it is. So on the right, it's more accurate, but less feasible. On the left, it's more feasible, but less accurate. So if we go to pressures, that's usually the right kind of data that we want to use. That's, for instance, land use changes by types and location in hectares, for instance, nitrogen, phosphorus concentrations, wetland conversions. Then we go through the GloBio model, and we translate pressures into impacts on biodiversity. The GloBio model is a peer-reviewed model developed by the PBL, Dutch environmental agency. If we don't have pressure data, we use what we call inventories data, and we use in-house tools that we developed to go back from inventories to pressures and then to impacts. So inventories would be, for instance, tonnages of commodities, GHG emissions, water consumed or withdrawn, nitrogen, phosphorus emissions. So inventories and pressures, for most people, you don't need to know the difference. That's the best type of data that we can use. That's emissions, tonnages, cubic meter of water, etc. If we don't have that, and we want to have that usually for companies, if we don't have that, then we use turnover and purchases, and we use the ExaioBase database, which is another peer-reviewed tool. And we go back to inventories, etc. As I said, it's less accurate. Next slide. So the pressures covered by the GBS are in line with the IPBES, so the equivalent of the IPCC for biodiversity. So land, sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species, that's the pressures of the IPBES. Unfortunately, in the GBS, we do not cover yet invasive alien species. We also do not cover on the right marine biodiversity due to scientific gaps. As soon as science will progress and have pressure impact relationships for that, we will include them. So I won't go into detail about the detailed pressures as we don't have time, and we will cover that in a webinar in January. But so the four out of 5 main IP-based pressures and 2 realms, terrestrial and freshwater, are covered in the GBS. On the next 2 slides, I'm going to talk about 2 concepts that are critical. So the first one is about accounting of stocks and variation of stocks. For climate, we focus on the greenhouse gas emissions and not so much into the cumulated emissions from the past. For biodiversity, that's key to focus on that. So on the left, you've got a chart showing the situation at the beginning of a fictitious assessment. You've got cropland and pastures. So the cropland is not an undisturbed ecosystem. So you have negative cumulated impacts, and that's what we call a static impact. And then we move to the right. At the end of the assessment, the farmer increased the surface area of the cropland, and you have additional periodic losses, and that's what we call dynamic impact. So that's a variation of impact. So it's very important to look at both the stock of remaining biodiversity, stock of past impacts, and additional gains or losses during the period assessed. That's what allows you to compare to the trajectory I showed at the beginning. On next slide, so the concept of scopes. If you are familiar with the climate world, the GHG protocol, you are familiar with the scopes. So here on the chart, you see a logging company. Its scope 1 in orange is all the logging, the warehouses it uses, the trucks it uses, which are operated by the company. So that's scope 1, direct operations. Then we split impacts also by upstream impacts, which includes scope 2, so all the purchases related to energy, and upstream scope 3, so all the other purchases. And then we have the downstream impacts, so downstream scope 3, which is all the impacts due to use and end of life of products and services. So in the GBS, we distinguish scope 1, 2, and 3, upstream and downstream, which is also compatible with the natural capital protocol. And to conclude, before handing over to you for the questions, so please use Mentimeter to ask the questions. So what are the solutions proposed by CDC Biodiversité to measure biodiversity impact? So if you are a company, a corporate, not financial institution, that's at the bottom. We have biodiversity footprint assessments to assess your impacts. If you are a financial institution, it depends whether it's non-listed assets, in which case we use the GBS for financial institutions, GBS FI, which is more tailor-made. Or if you have listed assets, then you can use the BIA GBS database, so Biodiversity Impact Analytics powered by the GBS, which we developed with Carbon for Finance, our partner. It's off-the-shelf database, so you just need to provide, for instance, easy numbers and the amount invested, and then you get the impacts. We also have trainings at the B4B+ Club to get on top of this topic and meet other corporates and financial institutions and do case studies. Thanks a lot for your attention, and so happy to answer all your questions now.